Hey everybody, welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about risk assessment. Much of the material is based on the work found in the 6th edition of the textbook Forensic Psychology. In this video in particular, we're going to talk about what is risk. So what are we talking about when we're talking about risk? And how is it, and where and how is it measured? So what are the reasons that we assess risk? What are some of the different methods by which we assess somebody's risk for offending, reoffending, and also the other areas where risk assessment is used? We'll look at specific risk factors. There's many of them. There's a big list, and that list changes. So we'll look at some of the areas that we would measure when we're assessing risk. And we'll look at some of the theoretical considerations as it relates to assessing risk in people. So I'd ask you, as you look at this video, think of this model, the biopsychosocial model. This is a very common model used in psychology and in social science generally, where we consider the biological elements of a person, the psychological and social elements of the person. So when we think biological, think, is there anything biological that could contribute to the risk of somebody offending, doing something that's maybe against norms or against the law? So could it be something like maybe something related to the development or an injury to their frontal lobe that affects impulse control? Is there a biological predisposition for certain psychological disorders? Is there something about their kind of neural development that affects their anger and this sort of thing? So, psychological, is there unresolved trauma? What's a person's emotional regulation like? What's their perception of the world like? And social, what's their environment? So here we would consider beliefs, we would consider social support, what environment are they currently in right now that may contribute to risk. So generally speaking, think of this biopsychosocial model again, very, very common, but it adds to the complexity. So it's not a simple question, is this person at risk of doing this? We ask the question, why does somebody commit a crime? It's not an easy answer. It's elements that are involved in all of these domains. Same question can apply to addictions. Why does somebody get addicted to something? Again, very complex and very individual. But think about this broadly as we look at some of the individual factors a bit later in this video. So what is risk assessment? So really it's an educated guess. It's what's the probability that this person will either offend or reoffend or cause harm, damage. These probabilities change. Some of them may be very contextual in the situation a person is in. If a person receives treatment for certain things, then that could reduce the risk. If their employment status changes, that could reduce the risk. So it's really, it's really an educated guess. What's the probability? What's the likelihood based on the factors that we're going to discuss that this person could be considered at risk? We look at it in through two different lenses. One, predicting the chance. Okay, so predicting, again, what is the likelihood this is going to happen? So it could be used at sentencing. So if somebody gets convicted of an offense, they're getting sentenced, the judge wants to consider what's the chance this person's going to do it again. Was this a one-off? Again, looking at the assessment, looking at the factors. So that will help determine, what type of sentence they get. Do they need a custodial sentence that maybe they need to be in a secure facility for treatment and for the safety of others? Or, is the probability quite low and maybe they could use some support in treatment? So maybe we'll go probation or conditional discharge or something else to allow that person to get that treatment because the probability of them reoffending, in a reasonable time period, given all the other considerations, is quite low. Pre-release, so when they're looking at parole, Parole board's considering somebody's parole. They're thinking, no, this person is at risk to the community. I mean, we've all seen, these public warnings where they'll say, okay, this offender is now moving into the community. Be warned that this person is now on parole in the community. Well, that person would have been assessed at a high risk to reoffend in order for them to give this warning. So they may have met all the other eligibility for maybe not parole, but for a statutory release, or they've come to the end of their sentence where now they have to be released because that warrant has expired, so they have to let this person out, but they are still considered high risk. So you will see those warnings pop up in media every once in a while in your community. And management. So for those folks who are on parole, somebody's being released on parole, they have a list of conditions. Those list of conditions are generally based on risk factors. So a condition of parole or probation may be, you must maintain employment. Well, that's there because at some point somebody had assessed that this person is much more at risk to offend if they're not working. Or a condition could be you must report any personal relationships or any romantic relationships. Because at some point somebody's assessed, okay, this person is at risk, when they're in a relationship or when a relationship ends or something like that. So kind of big lenses, it's used to predict future behavior, and then another one which is very big. So the whole parole system is essentially based on this. It's about managing risk. So if we're going to release somebody into the community, we need to manage those risk factors and supervise those risk factors. So risk assessments are used in civil settings, so civil as opposed to criminal. So this isn't necessarily if somebody's been charged with something, but they're used in lots of other settings. So civil commitment. So civil commitment is it's involuntary treatment. So in Nova Scotia, we have the Involuntary Psychiatric Treatment Act, which says if psychiatrist deems that you require treatment, you don't agree to the treatment, then the police can come and compel you to treatment. They can pick you up on a voluntary treatment warrant, take you to a psychiatric hospital for involuntary mandatory treatment. So for psychiatrists to make this decision, they need to assess the risk. What is the risk of this person if they don't get treatment? If you're going to authorize, somebody to essentially arrest somebody and lock them in a secure treatment facility, you need to do some sort of assessment, because again, if you're going to take away this person's right to freedom, lock them up, then you need some rationale and justification as to why you are mandating this involuntary treatment. Child protection cases, so think of, you're going to either take children away from their parents' caregivers, or you're going to return children back to that setting. Social workers in that case would be doing lots of risk assessments to determine, are we justified in removing these children, or are we justified in returning these children? Immigration, so whether it be a refugee case, some sort of immigration process, what is the risk of allowing this person to enter our community, our society? Are there risk factors that need to be considered in the cases of refugee where somebody is fleeing danger? What is the risk of returning them to that setting? It's used in school, used in labor, workplace settings. So in school, it's used to, any sort of community standards, behavior management. If it comes to suspending somebody, if it comes to maybe removing somebody from a certain class, or removing somebody from student housing, something like that, they want to consider the risks involved, and there would be risk assessment tools used there. In labor, it's used all the time in occupational health and safety, psychologically safe workplaces, which now falls under workers' compensation and occupational health and safety. So they're going to consider those risks. Duty to warn, so in therapeutic settings, counseling, this sort of thing, if a person is at risk to themselves or others, um, that can override any other sort of responsibility for confidentiality. So if a clinician, if a therapist is going to report something to the police or report something to community services or something, or to somebody else, then they have to do a risk assessment. Like, does this person really mean it? Do they have the means to carry out? So, say for example, a client threatens to hurt somebody, then that clinician, they would have ethical guidelines to follow, and depending on if they're licensed as a psychologist or licensed as a therapist, there would be a risk assessment process to determine, like, do I have to report this? What do they mean it? So they would look at risk factors to make that determination. Do I have to warn somebody about this if this person said this? Excuse me. Criminal settings, which will mostly be the focus of this video, they're conducted at different points. So before the trial, so that would be when they're considering remand and bail. Do we keep this person locked up until trial because they are at risk of doing something, maybe interfering with witnesses, committing another offense? When it comes to bail, how much, what is the risk that they're not going to show up for trial, or what is the risk they're going to breach their conditions? So they would consider that. Sentencing, which I've already mentioned. They want to consider, what do we do? So if somebody is going to be incarcerated, what level of security do they need? How long do they need? What makes sense? Is a community sentence okay? Is it not okay? So risk assessments would consider all of that. The judge would consider all that based on risk assessments for sentencing. And then release, as I mentioned, for parole, or if they come to the sentence expiry, which is, they serve their full time, then that's, again, where you might see some of these community mornings. Lawyers, so kind of lawyer-client confidentiality. Lawyers can't talk about, they can't disclose, past crimes. There's a kind of a list of things that they may be compelled to disclose. But any ongoing crimes or future crimes, they may have a responsibility to report that. So is there clear, serious, and imminent danger that another crime is about to be committed? Lawyers may be compelled ethically to disclose that. So that would require their own risk assessment. So legal ethics is its own field. So typically, if they know for certain, if they're going through the court process and they know for certain that their lawyer or that their client is lying about things, that they committed the crime, lawyers can't promote or be involved in perjury, which is lying to the court. So they may have to withdraw from the case. Likely wouldn't disclose it. They would likely just remove themselves if they knew that, which is kind of a sign that they know something. But if their client says, yeah, when I get out of here, these witnesses are going to pay. I'm going to get these witnesses. I'm going to get this guy who ratted on me. I got it set up. Then the lawyer may ethically have a responsibility, but they would have to do a risk assessment to determine, okay, is this valid enough for me to report it? Again, with sentencing, it's very important. There's something in Canada called the dangerous offender designation, which I don't think has been mentioned in any of the videos yet. So dangerous offender is when somebody is locked up, they're secured, they're incarcerated without an end date to their sentence. So, big famous cases in Paul Bernardo and others, the court may impose a dangerous offender designation. So the Crown would come forward with an application for a dangerous offender designation, which shows that the risk is too high to ever let this person out again, without that risk being mitigated. So then that person would be incarcerated, And then there are certain points where the case is reviewed, but there's no end date to the sentence. So again, the Crown would have to establish a very high risk of reoffense for the judge to go in that direction. So those are some ways, both civilly and criminally, which again is the focus of this video, where risk assessments are going to be used. So how do we do it? What are some ways of doing it? So unstructured clinical judgment really it's quite simply clinicians or other informed people sort of sitting around reviewing the files and talking about it. It really is just a professional clinical discretion, based on having a look at the files, knowing the person, people involved in the case management or treatment of the person, essentially saying, no, this person's too risky to get a day pass from the forensic hospital. So yeah, it's quite simple. Simply that it's just based, again, it's informed people who are informed with the individual as well as informed with the process, sitting around talking about it and coming up with decisions based on that. Actuarial prediction. So I think this is using sort of like quantitative analysis tools. So basically, there would be assessments done. So based on kind of the number that people get. So Hare's psychopathy checklist would be an example of one of these tools. So measuring psychopathy in a person, and they get a number, and so then based on this number, decisions are made around risk. Then there's structured professional judgment. So think of this as kind of a mixed methods. So they would use assessments. They would also use kind of anecdotal, maybe qualitative evidence. So maybe reports from maybe victim impact statements, maybe institutional reports if the person is incarcerated, observations. So if a person is in a forensic hospital for assessment, or maybe they're in a correctional institution, like what do the daily logs say? Like what are some of the reports say? How is this person interacting with others? Are there incidents that might not be offenses, but you could consider them maybe risky or antisocial or something like that? So it's a mix. It's a mix of that structured professional judgment, mix of that unstructured professional clinical judgment, as well as using assessment tools. So when we talk about risk factors, so what are these specific things that you want to measure? And so measure either in through observation, so all the either through qualitative analysis or quantitative analysis. So what are these specific data points or the specific factors that you want to measure? So again, there's categories of these. So there's static risk factors. So static risk factors are those things that don't change. So they're static. Let me bring that cup up here. So what happened in the person's past? So that can't change because it happened. So, did this person commit these offenses in the past? That's a yes or no. Yes, they did. It happened. Was there trauma or abuse? So maybe this person was abused as a child. It happened. It's historical. We can't change it. What is the person's age? So that, it will change every day, every minute it changes. But at the time, what is a person's age? Because age is a risk factor. An 18-year-old is higher risk than an 80-year-old. So at the time of the assessment, what is a person's age? So that is a static factor. Dynamic, what are those things that can be modified? So what are those things that can be changed? So things like attitude, employment status, education, skills training, job training, this sort of thing. Attitude. So do you have a pro-criminal attitude? Well, that, maybe through education, treatment, exposure, environment, that could change. So static are those things that can't be changed at the time of assessment. Dynamic are those things that can be modified. So dynamic factors, also known as criminogenic factors or criminogenic needs, depending on kind of where you're reading it, it's the same thing. So dynamic factors are more, if we're looking at it again as a factor. Needs, that would be more on the management side. So what, where does this person need support, help, supervision, monitoring, based on these factors? The factors are the same. Parenting, family relationships, education, employment history. So, if somebody is broke, they don't have any tangible employment skills, they have a low level of education, they're more at risk because they don't have the resources, maybe to live the life that they want. Substance abuse. Leisure recreation choices. So how does this person spend their free time? What are they doing? Who are they hanging out with? Peer relationships. What's their emotional regulation like? Are they quick to anger? Or what emotional regulation, emotional intelligence do they possess? Mental health. Are there any diagnoses there, or is there anything that are there symptoms there that lead towards a diagnosis of something? And has it been treated, or is it what does treatment look like for it? Is it sort of a relatively, I'll say, easy? Is it something that can be treated quite easily to help the person? Attitudes, what are their attitudes towards crime? Did they grow up maybe in a family that had very pro-criminal attitudes? Maybe this person's always wanted to be in a gang. Maybe this person's always wanted to be a gangster. They love the criminal lifestyle. There are people out there who do. And there are people who are quite happy with that. So yeah, what's their attitudes towards it? Are they remorseful? Are they okay with it? What are their attitudes towards this? Residential stability. We know that, in Canada we have the kind of housing first model when it comes to helping people who are insecurely housed, because we know that's a risk factor. I mean, if you are, you don't have a stable environment, so we usually talk about that when it comes to children, but it applies to adults as well. And you think of, kind of basic theories like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, you need a safe, before you can start thinking of your attitude and thinking about some of these higher level things, you need a place to live, you need food, you need some feelings of psychological safety. So if you don't possess that, then the risk is higher that you may do something antisocial or illegal. So when it comes to categorizing some of these risks, both static and dynamic risks, we'll talk a little bit about the four categories in a bit more detail. So there's historical. So again, what has happened in the past? Can't change that. Dispositional. So dispositional is about the individual. So think dispositional, disposition. So what is their disposition? Like, what is their personality? What are some of these other things like? Clinical, so is there anything diagnosable there? Contextual, so think of that as environmental. So what's their environment? So we're going to we'll look at all four of these in a bit more detail. So historical, this idea of maybe looking at their record, and again, not necessarily just criminal records, because there's a lot of things that people do that they don't get caught for, or somebody could be a terror in their workplace or in their home or in their town, but they've never been charged for it. But there has been a lot of antisocial behavior. Maybe it's that person who gets in fights all the time, who's prone to anger, who is very emotionally abusive, which isn't illegal to be emotionally abusive. Seems strange, but It's not. But yeah, so what's this? What's the history of this person? Again, what was their childhood like? What's happened in the past? Again, if has this person did they grow up in an abusive home and neglect or a neglectful home, which is a form of abuse? It can't be changed. It's not necessarily a predictor, but it is a risk factor. Okay, so what happened in the past? They would consider that. Dispositional. So again, think of what is it? Think of individual differences. Think it's what is it about this person? So think age, sex, gender, personality characteristics. What's their attitude towards crime like? Kind of generally speaking, the most kind of the riskiest person would be a young, male identified, unemployed, not in a relationship, because relationships can be moderators of behavior. So yeah, so if you have a kind of a young, male identified, broke, unemployed, not in school, no relationship, they're the riskiest. And I think that makes sense because there's impulse. Again, you if you're not in a relationship, or if you're not employed, there may be or relationship is about moderating your behaviors. If you have somebody with you, a partner with you, says, "Hey, don't do this," or you're acting like a jerk, don't behave this way. It can moderate your behavior. If you have financial difficulties, you don't have a social structure. So if you're not in school or if you're not working, you don't have a social environment that again that could give you something to lose. So, which is the reason many of us don't commit crimes, is because I don't want to risk doing this. So there's the whole ethics, morals thing. But then there's also, it's like, I don't want to lose what I have. I don't want to lose my relationships. I don't want to get kicked out of school. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to, get in trouble. These sorts of things. Which ties into the personality characteristics again. Is this person prone to anger? Do they have low impulse control? Do they have a kind of a lack of consequential thinking? Do they possess some sort of antisocial attitudes? Maybe around like emotions. Is there some narcissism there? So what is it about that individual? Then there's the clinical stuff, so substance use and mental illness. So with substance use is what is the impact of somebody using substances? So are they the type of person is every time they drink alcohol, they have a major personality change. They get angry or they get reckless every time they drink alcohol. Do they have a physical addiction to a substance? So are they physically addicted to something like opioids, whereby now that drug becomes just as important as air or water. They need it, and so then is there a risk of them committing crime in order to get that? So that other example would be more of the indirect effects. So are you committing crime in order to obtain drugs? Are you committing crime as part of a drug using lifestyle? So maybe somebody steals your drugs and you seriously assault them. The main cause of that is the fact that drugs are at the center of the lifestyle. So that would be the indirect effects. Does somebody have a psychological disorder, which then contributes to an offense? So again, most people who are in secure treatment in a forensic hospital have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. However, most people with schizophrenia don't commit crimes. So it's not a direct predictor, but it could be a risk factor. If somebody is whatever, it doesn't really matter what the illness is. Anything related to psychosis tends to be more directly linked to committing offenses because a person is in a different world, and so their actions, their criminal actions, whatever kind of offensive behaviors they're putting out there, To them, it seems real, but they're working on a different plane, I guess, or a different level. Contextual, think environment. So what does this person have for social supports? Um, so we talk about instrumental social support. So is that somebody who can help you with those basic necessities of life? So again, if you think Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so do you have somebody who can, you know, give you a room if you need a room? Do you have somebody you can call? It's like, hey, I have no place to go. Can I crash on your couch for a week? Can I do, can you feed me? Can you these basics of life? Can you lend me some money? Do you have anybody in your life like that? Do you have any emotional support? So do you have anybody around you who maybe you are becoming overwhelmed with emotions? Is there anybody you can talk to about that? Because again, if you are overwhelmed, it affects your decision making. It can affect your coping skills, and then the behaviors that follow that. Do you have anybody to help you with this the appraisal reflective pieces of life? So maybe you go through something, you lose your job, you go through a breakup. Is there anybody you can talk to kind of think like, how maybe what happened here? Like, I have handled things differently, or how should I be handling it now? So somebody to kind of reflect on life and to kind of make decisions. Um, yeah, and moving forward from there. Do you have anybody who can help, like, to serve as a resource? So information. So like, listen, I need help with my resume. Can you help me with my resume? I'm trying to find a job. I'm trying to find a place to live. How do I do this? Is there anybody in your life that you can call on for these sorts of resources? So that again, it's not even, and they don't necessarily have to be friends, but are you able to access resources for any of these things? So that's why you see a lot of social service agencies, this is what they focus on, right? So they focus on this because a lot of people don't always have, or they don't realize they have these supports in their life, and they contribute to risk. Does the person have access to weapons or victims? So if somebody says, I'm going to kill so and so, okay, that's a serious threat. It's illegal to say that. Uttering threats causing death is a charge. But if you've worked with people, there are some people they say it all the time. So this is why you have to do this risk assessment. Like, do they really mean this? Do they have the means to carry this out? So do they have access to weapons? Do they have access to the victims? Um, so yeah, I mean, it's illegal. It's a very serious threat, but oftentimes this is where you'd have to do this quick risk assessment and say, okay, what do they mean by this? Where's this fall as far as the probability or on a risk assessment continuum? So talk about some theories, some theoretical considerations. Again, it's very complex to say, is somebody at risk? Because there are people who will do horribly on a risk assessment. When I say do horribly, means they score very high, but then there may be a lot of other anecdotal evidence that doesn't suggest that. What does that mean? I don't know, but it means that it's very complex, that intersectionality, that biopsychosocial intersectionality, the fact that dynamic risk factors can change. You may have somebody who's doing very well, one thing changes, and all of a sudden they are at risk at any point of their life. So this question why is just it's very complex, and that's why sometimes they get risk assessments wrong. Um, yeah, they get risk assessments wrong. So there are cases here in Nova Scotia. There are cases from the East Coast Forensic Hospital where people have been given a pass. So they scored fine on the risk assessment. Yes, you can get a release from the hospital. So a very famous case in Halifax, the Ray Tavel murder, where a person was released from the forensic hospital on a pass. They left the hospital, proceeded to go to downtown Halifax, and killed somebody. So just a kind of random individual on the street on Gottingen Street, and they ended up killing them. This is a person who they had designated as low risk, but when he left, he started drinking. So it was that one factor, which then combined with, his history and mental illnesses, when he consumed alcohol, that changed the whole risk level, and sadly he ended up killing somebody. Yeah, so another theory is kind of this coping relapse model. So this idea of, again, it comes to emotional regulation, it comes to sort of the appraisal of stimuli, so of threatening stimuli. It's so looking at this case, if you were to Google it, if you were to Google Ray Tavel was the victim, very well-known activist in downtown Halifax. So if you look at the offender in this situation, who was found guilty of manslaughter, think of, cognitive appraisal of the situation. So it turned out there was an exchange of words, individual influences. So you think of this person had a very serious diagnosis for psychiatric disorder. He was already in treatment at the forensic hospital. Environmentally, lots of stimuli, downtown Halifax, again, under the influence of a substance. And then coping and response mechanisms. So if this was a person who had committed violence offenses in the past, that might have been a learned behavior throughout their whole life. He may have come from a family that used violence. I don't know. But the fact is that people, again, you perceive a stimuli that you perceive as dangerous, provokes an emotional response. What is your then reaction to that emotional response? For some people, it's violence. Others, it's a more controlled emotional regulation. For others, it's withdrawal. That flight part. They just freeze or withdraw from the situation. So what's happening here? So as far as assessing risk, if you can get a better sense of what's happening with the individual. So at what kind of stages? Is it the environment? Is it the emotions? So getting an understanding of what's happening there, then that can help with maybe monitoring treatment or maintenance. Studies around female identified offenders is that there are differences in criminality. So the types of offenses, how the offenses are committed, often the history of the offender. Bring some of these up. Oftentimes, if you were to look at the case history of female identified offenders, there's often victimization. So in their past, so whether it be family or intimate partner violence, but there's almost always some form of victimization. There often is for male identified too, but it's higher rates for female identified. The crimes tend to look different for female identified offenders. The rates of crime are lower. They tend to be either more violent, or in the cases of property crimes, these sorts of things, they tend to be with somebody else. So they tend to be often with a male identified person. Risk factors and the methods and tools that they use are often the same. Different risk factors to consider. Again, just around how sort of female gender socialization happens in the Western world. So think of seeing, self-esteem, and that maybe internalizing of certain kind of issues, or issues, problems, or perceptions, I guess. There's often a history of self-injurious behavior, which can look different for everybody. Yeah, it is different, and this is why there are different institutions. There's often different treatment methods. Security classifications can look different for female identified offenders and male identified offenders. So in Nova Scotia, female identified, they're in the for provincial, there's one unit in Burnside, so it's the East unit, and that's where those folks go. And for federal offenders doing 2 years or more, there's Nova Institution in Truro, which is a full federal facility for the eastern region where female identifiers would go to serve their sentence. Indigenous offenders, Indigenous people are greatly overrepresented in the justice system, particularly in provinces where there are more Indigenous people. So if you like out in the prairie region, Correctional Service of Canada is broken up, BC prairie region, Central and Atlantic region. So there's 4 regions in Canada. Particularly in the prairie region where there are more Indigenous people living. They're greatly overrepresented here as well, but the numbers are bigger out west. Excuse me. Oh, shoot. Let's see if I can go back. Sorry, I can't go back there. Okay, I'll just talk about it. So essentially just looking at things, so as far as risk factors go, so it's urbanization of Indigenous people, so Indigenous people who moved maybe from more rural reserve community into the city, and then all the things that go along with that. So if you're looking at resources, you're looking at stability, you're looking at cultural assimilation, those sorts of things, they're risk factors. Treatment can look different, as well as sentencing, so depending on the risk, depending on the community involvement as well. So in Indigenous communities, which have traditional kind of ways of dealing with behavior, how much are they going to be involved in the process? So in our justice system over the last number of years, there's been a greater emphasis on including traditional methods, including communities in working with Indigenous offenders when it comes to either managing risk or just the healing, the sentencing process. So there's in Nova Scotia, we have just one Indigenous court, which is in Wagamocook and Cape Breton. So there are healing circles and sentencing circles and these sorts of things that are all throughout Nova Scotia. But I think the only Indigenous court is in Wagamocook, which came as a result of the community wanting to be involved. The fact that it was about an hour and a half or so to Port Hawkesbury, which was the closest provincial court. So there were many accused people who weren't coming to court because they lived in a rural community who weren't able to make it to court. So that's a risk factor. So if you're calling somebody, somebody has a warrant, they have a summons to appear in court, they have no way of getting there. They don't show up. Now they get another charge because they didn't obey the summons. So now they get another charge, which makes them more at risk. When in reality, is the risk really high, or do they just not have a way to get to court? So in looking at those resources, so they opened a provincial court in Wagamocook. If you're interested in this, federally is the Gladue report. So there's a document called the Gladue report, which essentially is it came from looking through this lens of how Indigenous people are received, treated, dealt with in the criminal justice system in Canada, what's missing, what's needed, where is the system not being responsive. So if that is something you're interested in, just Google the Gladue report, and that is the guiding document today. So when we look at risk factors, there's also protective factors. So again, like what is the reason why most of us haven't been in trouble with the law? Like what are some of these things? So what can help? So it's almost, they're like risk factors, but looking at them through a different lens. Let me bring these up. So if again, if you were to do a risk assessment on yourself, you were to look at some of these factors, we'll say, yeah, sometimes I do this, or sometimes I think this way. But there's often enough protective factors to mitigate those risk factors. This is why you may have people who grow up in very similar environments. They have very similar personalities, or they've been exposed to the same things. One person may end up in a life of addictions or end up in a life of criminality, whereas the other person completely avoids it. So what's there? What are those protective factors that are mitigating this? So is there pro-social involvement? Is there, it's kind of a catchphrase, where you just need one person to make a difference in your life. So maybe you have two people coming from the same environment, but this one person had a teacher or a coach or a social worker or whomever to serve as that role model and to make a difference for that person and give that person those protective factors and a different way of thinking. Maybe it's around, having a job, having a skill. You don't have those extra pressures, so maybe you're kind of your stress tolerance, your coping skills they can only go up to an 8, and that 8 is already filled with trauma and life and everything else. But then you add on there, you lose your job, or you don't have any of the skills necessary to get a job, then that puts your stress level to the point where there may be a crisis, or you may emotionally dysregulate and do something. Positive social orientation. So you care about the world, you care about other people. You're not involved in these pro-criminal attitudes. You care what other people feel like. You don't want to hurt somebody else. And strong attachment. So this is why having a job, having, going to school, being part of some sort of community, and either not wanting to disappoint them, or knowing that I have responsibilities to them, so therefore I can't do this. They are protective factors. Intelligence when it comes to decision making, to coping skills, to understanding the context of certain situations, understanding the consequences of your actions and what that can mean, and being able to project and predict. So if I do this, then this could result in all of this stuff that could affect my next 10 years. So having the intellect to be able to analyze certain situations that we might find ourselves in. So again, talking about the kind of some of the theoretical considerations around all of this. Like with any tool and with any psychological assessment, it's only as good as the person using it. How trained is that individual who's using this risk assessment tool? What, and not just trained in the tool, like what are their listening skills? Like, are they asking the right questions? Are they actually listening and asking probing questions or follow-up questions to really get kind of to the root of the information that you need? How has this tool been validated, across communities, maybe across the world? Like, what is the research behind it? Some organizations will have their own, and this applies to universities and schools, they'll come up with their own risk assessment tool. Like, has it been validated, or is it kind of a mishmash of other things? I'm not saying it's not good, but what's the validity and reliability behind it? We've talked at the beginning, there's this tension between the criminal justice system and psychology. Psychologists and those working in the field of psychology, and those in the criminal justice system, and lawyers, particularly lawyers and judges and law enforcement people, they have different language, they're trained differently. They're trained to look at situations differently than psychologists. So are these tools, are they measuring the right thing, and can it be articulated in a way that these triers of facts, so the judge and the jury, even the, the parole board, that they're going to understand it. So, can those results be disseminated to these folks in a way that's actually gonna have an impact, and that they're gonna know what it means, and maybe not take it too seriously or not seriously enough. Oh my goodness, sorry, folks. I don't know if I can go back 1 second. No, I apologize. I can't seem to go back here. Bear with me. Okay, well, we'll just skip that one. I'll come back. I'll explain an explanation for that other slide here at the end. So why do people stop committing crime? So there are many reasons. They relate to these protective factors. So if you have more protective factors in your life, then the risk factors don't mean as much. You have more reason not to do it than to do it. Um, so there are many people. I have friends of mine who, they had a very serious, significant criminal history earlier in their life, um, but then some things changed. Those dynamic factors changed. Again, it's just as complicated as to why people do it as to why they stop doing it. So this one individual is a friend. He works as a national program director for a Canadian organization that helps offenders. Um, and for this guy, and he talks about this, so I'm not breaching any confidentiality. He read so he was an armed robber. He would, walk into drugstores and other businesses with a gun and, stick them up, give me your money. And when he was younger, he thought, okay, this is a victimless crime. These are big businesses. They're not going to miss anything. Until he read a pre-sentence report, or sorry, no, it was a victim impact statement. So when people are victims of crime, they can write a statement, which then gets presented to the court as evidence. So he had read the impact statement of a person who was working in a pharmacy that he had robbed, and then that's when the emotional side of things kicked in for him. He didn't realize that he was scaring these people. He didn't realize that this person was now traumatized, and other victims were likely traumatized by his actions. And for him, that became the big mitigator as far as stopping doing crime. He's like, I never realized that I was actually affecting people. I thought I was only affecting businesses and money. I didn't realize I was affecting people in this way, and that became kind of the starting point for him changing his life. And now for the last 14 years being crime free and working on the other side of the system. Um, Age makes a difference. Like I said, younger people are riskier. Again, just because of impulse decision making, lack of resources. With maturity, with age, and also if there is, as a person ages, if there is a diminishment of physical strength and this sort of thing, then you may be less able to do certain types of crimes. You get into stable relationships, you get a stable job, you become kind of a member of society. So again, you have social supports, you have your context changes. There's more protective factors, then you're less likely to commit an offense. Okay. Please reach out. Any thoughts or questions? So really, to sum it up, there's many methods of assessing risk. They are essentially all imperfect. They're really only as good as the person collecting the data and those interpreting it. But it's a necessary tool at all aspects of the criminal, like at all points, I should say, of that criminal justice process. It's that intersection of biology, psychology, sociology. Um, there is a great emphasis not just on those dynamic factors, but how is that person perceiving those factors? So you may have a healthy, stable relationship, but if you don't perceive it as that, or you perceive it as something else, then it may not be a protective factor to you. It'll be that perception then is a risk factor. So it can be very deep, very complex. But yeah, if you have any questions, thoughts about it, then please reach out to me by email. I'm happy to chat about it over email or on Teams. Well, thank you very much, everybody.